It's Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. This May, Queen's Public Library honors a legacy of leadership and resilience, celebrating the strength, vision, and lasting impact of AANHPI leaders who have paved the way for future generations. Join us for special programs, book recommendations, and more at queenslib.org/AANHPI 2025. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and QPL is joining the national movement to bring awareness to mental health and to fight the stigma that surrounds it. We're also offering programs, workshops, and resources designed to help teens and adults build the coping strategies that will assist them now and in the future. Visit queenslibrary.org to learn more. Stay connected to Queen's Public Library on social media. It's where you'll find great QPL content, updates about what's happening at the library, and much more. Search for us on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Threads, YouTube, and X. And don't forget, we have an Instagram just for QPL teens, too.
God, I love libraries. Oh, we're live. Okay, yes. Good evening. I'm Tim Barnes, comedian and writer for such shows as The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, creator of the Comedy Central animated web series Maurice on Mars, and host of the interview podcast You Are the Genre. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to Culture Connection. Culture Connection is curated by Dan Zaleski and assisted by Liz Keoghan. And now, in its 12th year at the Queen's Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film, now expanding into the virtual format right here in the virtual space of the internet. Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. And right now, we're pleased to bring you a discussion with best-selling fantasy writer Lev Grossman. Now, Grossman, right here, is the author of 8 novels, including the New York Times bestselling Magicians trilogy. The trilogy has been published in 30 countries and was adapted into a television series that ran for 5 seasons on Sci-Fi. And The Bright Sword in 2024 is his most recent novel, and it's a retelling of the story of King Arthur. Lev, can I call you Lev?
You definitely can. I will call you Lev.
It's a pleasure to speak with you right now. And I also kind of want to apologize because I sent you a couple days ago just like a general concept of like what we could talk about. And I was so excited about The Magicians because The Magicians is something that I discovered on the TV show format. In the middle of quarantine, it became like my spouse and I, it was our form of escape watching that show. And it was a magical experience for us. And so I gave you this run through and I was like, yeah, we could talk about The Magicians and all this. And you very kindly, in response, were like, hey, maybe we can also talk about my most recent novel, The Bright Sword. And you did it in the nicest way possible. But it made me wonder, does that get frustrating to you sometimes, like the way people might focus on The Magicians?
Oh, no, actually not. I mean, I spent the first half of my career as a writer being really unsuccessful. Very clear, vivid memories of what it was like to have nobody know about any of my books ever. So if anybody knows about The Magicians, I feel happy. If they know about The Bright Sword, I feel happy. It's all good.
Nice. Well, a lot of what I want to focus this conversation on is about escapism and your form of escapism, because it feels like the Grossman effect is that there's a heavy dose of the real, a heavy dose of a sort of irony. And I wonder where that stems from. Like, how did escapism play a role in your life since you were a kid?
I mean, I think for most of my childhood, it played the normal role of forgetting about my childhood while it was happening. That is a little simplistic, obviously, but definitely, I think the one of the sort of primal founding moments for me for the Magicians was actually reading Watchmen.
Okay.
I am old enough that I remember when the graphic novel of Watchmen came out. I was just about to graduate high school, and he did something that I didn't know was possible, which was I don't know if you're familiar with the comic, but it's a superhero story, and he breaks every possible rule of superhero storytelling. Basically, he says, "Wait! The conventions of this genre are a little absurd. Let me poke at them a little bit. Actually, I've got this hatchet here. I'm just going to cut them down completely." And the amazing thing is that when he did that, the result was not nothing. It was the greatest superhero story I had ever read. So this idea that you can poke at the assumptions that underlie a genre and have it make the story stronger rather than weaker, that was so fascinating to me. And I think I pretty consciously, when I started writing The Magicians, I had that idea in mind. Let's investigate a little bit. Let's tell a story, and also in doing so, let us investigate some of what underlies the idea, the fantasy genre, as a way not of criticizing it, but by making it, hopefully, I don't know, more interesting, feel more real, more grounded. Yeah. I also had in mind Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. It's a foundational book for me. It's very long. I give it to I know, and I have about a 50% success rate with getting people to read it. But she has a way of describing magic, which it's very physically grounded. It feels it's as though it's like Hemingway's describing magic, or Virginia Woolf. A great observer of the real world is now observing magic happening. And it gives the story this incredibly grounded, real feel, as if somebody is doing magic in the room with you. And that was another goal, really, for the Magicians. So in some ways, the word ironical, even snarky, got attached to The Magicians in a few reviews. And I take a small amount of issue with that, because all I really wanted to do was to tell a story that felt real.
Nice, and it felt like a bit of a manipulation of form, and the concept of a school for magic, it was kind of already in the air. So it feels like just like objectively, pop culturally, there's some friction between The Magicians and something like like Harry Potter.
It's funny. As I mentioned, that I had struggled as a writer until I started writing The Magicians, which happened when I was 35. So I had been struggling for a while. And one of the things that I found incredibly energizing was this feeling that I was writing The Magicians. This is going to sound delusional, but bear with me. I was writing The Magicians sort of to somebody. I was writing it to C.S. Lewis, sort of to say, yeah, I love the Narnia books so much. They're some of my favorite books in the world. And yet also I feel as though there were some spots maybe they missed. And the same was true of J.K. Rowling. I didn't realize how many spots she was missing at the time, 2009. But there was something very energizing about this idea that I was creating friction between what I was writing and something else that was out there. That Stoppard play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which sort of takes characters from Hamlet and just does this fascinating stuff with them. I'm not a good writer as Stoppard, but I felt as though I was trying to get at some of that same feeling of responding to stuff that was out there in that way that fan fiction often does. You see fan fiction doing these brilliant riffs on sort of existing characters, and I wanted to have some of that same feel in The Magicians.
What is the specificity of the marketing genre of The Magicians? Because in reading it and thinking about it leading up to this conversation, I went back to a moment I had in middle school where I've written many I've had many failed attempts at writing something like fantastical or science fictional in the prose form. And there was one thing that I wrote in middle school that I was like excited about, and I think my dad saw it on a computer, and there was a curse word in it, and it was a big issue that I had a character who was my age in middle school saying a curse word, and I think that is the thing that's kind of like rebellious in a fun way, is that your work really focuses on how people actually talk, and it feels like that is on some level the friction as well.
Very much so. Very much so. In part, it's just being writing fantasy as an American. Fantasy, and particularly Harry Potter and Narnia. That stuff is so rooted in this English way of speaking and using language. My mother is English, and so I have a number of English cousins. And I remember growing up, and I would hang out with them, and they really sounded like BBC commentators, and I sounded like total loser kid from the suburbs of Boston, which is what I was. They sounded so more compelling and interesting and grown up than me. And I thought, part of it was just, what if we transplanted this story to America and had these characters talk like Americans and swear. I feel as though with the sort of explosion of dark academia as a genre, that's been done a lot since, but at the time it felt very naughty. And
okay. So wait, I've never heard this term, dark academia. That's a genre you're saying?
It's a subgenre.
Okay.
I think this idea of exploring education and sort of the search for knowledge in a fantasy context. There have been many books, since the aughts that explored that in ways that, in sort of wonderful, interesting ways. I remember finishing The Magicians and thinking, no one will ever think of anything else to do in a school for magic, because I thought of everything. Not true. So there is now this sort of thriving subgenre.
You mentioned a moment ago the sort of dark period, speaking of dark academia, of your career as a writer. What do you think it was about The Magicians in particular that stood out? Like, and is there a through line between that early work and The Magicians and The Bright Sword?
There definitely is. If I look back I wrote 2 novels before I wrote The Magicians, and if I look back at them, which I usually avoid doing if possible, they're very much like apprentice work. I can see that I was trying to negotiate some kind of way of coordinating between genre fiction, genre stories, and realist stories. I've on the one hand, pianists who played jazz and pop will sometimes say that they were classically trained.
Yeah,
I was classically trained in a way as a writer, because my parents are both English professors. I studied literature in college. I even went to grad school for a few years doing comparative literature. I got a thorough grounding in sort of literary classics, like I guess you could say, and I love them, and I still continue to love them. And yet also I was obsessed with fantasy and science fiction. And on the one hand, you had these writers who were working, especially the modernists, who I mostly studied. You're working so hard to make fiction approximate the experience of being a person in the world. In that way, you feel very lost. Maybe your life doesn't really have a plot. It's not organized in that way that genre fiction is. It's not suspenseful or interesting. And they're trying to inhabit and sort of understand that sort of state of being, which was fascinating to me. And also, I really love the genre stuff, even though it did not have the virtue of, resembling real life in any way. It still meant something to me. And I think I was trying to figure out how to coordinate between those two traditions. But it was definitely, it wasn't very successful. And I think that's partly because I was just a very slow learner. I think it's partly because I felt quite overwhelmed with old. I think I sort of felt like I'd read almost too much. I was overwhelmed with all these voices that that were kind
Oh
of in
yeah.
my head, and I was having trouble picking out my own. I'm sure, my because my parents were so devoted to they would never call them the great books, but I don't know, the canon or something or other. The idea of writing fantasy, writing genre fiction, as much of it as I read, which I read it all the time, it was very slow to actually occur to me. It felt quite forbidden in a way. This was the kind of writing of which my parents would never approve.
Because you felt like they wouldn't take it seriously.
Yeah, it wasn't respectable in some way.
Yeah. It feels like I feel like the writers who have the most challenging genre is romance. I was thinking about this week. Like that's a challenging genre to get past people's biases towards. If you say you're writing a romance novel.
Really true, really true. If I complain about being a fantasy writer, romance writers, they have it tough in terms of getting the respect. But of course, although I found it initially dismaying, the fact that I knew that it was going to annoy my parents, eventually I found it incredibly fun and exciting to annoy my parents. And I realized this was the kind of writing that they weren't into. It didn't have their fingerprints on it. They were not masters of it. I felt incredibly free writing fantasy. And I think it was something that allowed me to get something off my chest in a way that that I hadn't been able to earlier. I think I always thought of myself as I would be sort of a wordsmith, an incredible sort of literary craftsman, making these incredibly cool, highly polished sentences. Very subtle and stuff like that. It actually turned out, even though that's the kind of sort of the way I was trained to read, it's not the kind of writer that I was. I was a writer, as it turned out, who really wanted to tell stories. In that old kind of mythological kind of way. And hopefully I could polish up the surface sufficiently to make it work. But it was really about the plot for me. And it was something I was very slow to recognize about myself as a writer.
Well, it's fantastic that you love getting all of the gratitude that you can for your books. You don't feel like, don't talk about this because I'm onto the new thing. We got a comment from a watcher right now named Elizabeth who said the Magician's Trilogy are her favorite books. I've read them every January for the past 3 years and 5 times overall. I can't wait to read The Bright Sword. Thank you for your tale, Mr. Grossman. That has to be very very heartening to read something like that, especially coming out of my voice.
It means actually the entire world to me, and never stops being. That's why I write books.
Amazing. And am I mistaken? This might be wrong, but did you once work in a science or tech related field?
Well, I always thought that if I didn't become a writer, that I would try to become a scientist. I started out as a chemistry major in college, and eventually, when I started to work for Time, initially I worked kind of behind the scenes in their computer section department. Eventually, I transitioned over to writing, but I wrote a lot about technology.
There we go.
I spent a lot of time talking to engineers. About what they were doing and what they were working on, because I found it endlessly interesting. And I love and it's funny, I actually love the way that engineers and scientists use language. They use it so literally, so clearly to explain these incredibly complicated ideas. I feel like I learned a lot from them. It was somewhat surreal in a way, because I was doing this at a time when the web was blowing up even further than it had already blown up. And I ended up spending time with the Google guys and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, people like that. And I have this sort of Zelig-like presence where I show up in the background of photographs of these incredibly
oh my God. The modern wizards of our age, some might say. But that comes to mind because it feels like the way that, especially in the Magicians franchise, that you describe magic and the there's a technicality behind it. It's not just words. There's something physical taking place, and that's what stood out to me so much, especially when I was watching the show, because my comic brain goes wild, and I'm like, oh, it's like I kept imagining a sketch where like Snoop Dogg goes to break bills, and he's just doing gang signs, and it's it's making things happen. But
yeah, yeah. I always thought of magic as science-like. I feel like it would fundamentally have there would be a wildness or a sort of, I don't know, a chaotic element in it that would make it ever so slightly off from being from science. The essence of science is doing an experiment and being able to have reproducible results, have the same thing happen every time you do something. And I felt like there had to be something very, there had to be a lot of unintended consequences around magic, and things not always working the same way for no ascertainable reason, because if you pin magic down all the way, it starts to become mundane. That was one of the criticisms of the magic in the Harry Potter stories, which I loved at the time, but I can certainly see that magic becomes very domesticated in those books, and I wanted to retain a little bit of that undomesticated character, but also to try to have that realness that obviously has. I've always felt that fantasy novels, they cut away from the magic too fast, almost like someone will do a spell and there'll be a flash of light or whatever, and then we'll move on with our day. I always wished that the kind of camera or the eye would rest a little bit longer on the magic and not just be an eye. You'd be able to hear the magic being done, sort of smell what kind of the smoke smells like or whatever. And really sort of sink into it in this way that felt physically real. It's one of the things I tried to do with the magicians was linger a little bit longer. And I remember with the show also, I was always encouraging them to linger on the effects shots and not cut away. Like, can I just stare at that glowing thing for a little bit longer?
Well, moving on from the magicians, what I love. What I love about The Bright Sword is that it feels like a novel that you can sip whiskey to. It's the same way I feel about Andor right now. It's just great to have like a show like that where it's like it doesn't feel weird to be drinking hard liquor while you watch it. And you kick it off though with we were talking about this a bit before we went live here. You kick it off with a Monty Python quote. And I think that was actually very fitting. You were saying that some people gave you, specifically British people, gave you a hard time about kicking things off with that. But I loved that because when I just read the description of the Bright Sword, and I'll read that right now, a gifted young knight named Colum arrives at Camelot to compete for a spot on the Round Table, only to find that he's too late. The king died 2 weeks ago at the Battle of Camelon, I hope I said that right, leaving no heir, and only a handful of the Knights of the Round Table survive. What I love about that is that, again, reading that with my primarily comedy brain, I'm like, this is going to be a hilarious romp. And in some ways it is. Like I could pitch that exactly as a comedy, but the book isn't necessarily that. And I think that's another sort of friction that you work with. A lot of your work has this comedic edge to it. Especially I find I'm just always like, the middle school part of me is tickled when there's a curse word, but it's and that reminds me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail in another way, because it's shot incredibly, but it is not a glossy interpretation of the King Arthur story, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There's a lot of dirt and grime in that film, and there's a lot of dirt and grime in your book.
Yeah, it's very true. It was actually a source of irritation to me because I wanted to. Obviously, I'm not writing in Brythonic or Old English or anything like that, but I wanted to have the characters swear a good amount because I feel like whatever what swearing was to them. They would do it a lot, but they didn't drop any F-bombs or S-bombs back in the day. That was not. I think maybe because there was so much of that just going on around every day. It wasn't even.
You're a very polite looking person, Lev. So, like, where's this coming from? Where's your day-to-day cursing happening? Where is it all in your mind, or are you just like a different person off camera?
I like to think of myself. I'm just more so. There is a lot of. It's true. There's a lot of bad language in my house, more than is suitable for a father of 3 children. There you have it. Just to close the loop on that, people in the Middle Ages, they didn't swear the way we did. They would say God's bones, or they would say God's knees, and that would be, and everybody would say, "Whoa, dude, just take it down a notch." That would be a swear to them, and it sounded. I have them do a fair amount of that in the book, but it doesn't feel the same as having them actually swear, which I also have them do. It's a complete anachronism. But the question about the comedy is so important to me. It's so fundamental to me. I get boringly serious and earnest about the comedy because it's something that I feel was. It's such a natural part about the way people talk to each other, interact socially, and experience their own lives. At some point they just have to laugh because something goes just so incredibly wrong. Like you show up at Camelot 2 weeks after Arthur died. How much does that suck? And you process that in part by trying to laugh at it. There's my love of the fantasy genre is unlimited, but there's a lot of it that's very earnest and doesn't have people joking around to the extent that I feel like they probably would. It gives some distance. Again, it's that Alan Moore thing of not taking the conventions too seriously. Just there is something quite funny about someone who would put on tights and go out and beat up muggers. That's an ordinary thing to do, but genre treats it less. That's what you would, if you had superpowers, that's what you would do, obviously. There's something quite funny about that, and it would be funny to people in the real world, just as I feel like so much of what people had to deal with in the medieval period, they must have laughed about it. Even though the conventions, I think of, right, well, Chaucer's quite funny, but there's a lot of not very funny medieval epics out there, and I wanted to get a little closer, I feel like, to that lived feeling.
Yeah, and you are tackling that era in a very honest way. And the Middle Ages, that's what we're talking, or the medieval, what is the term? It is so, it's so elusive and strange. I feel like whenever we think about it, we don't know the difference between fact and fiction. I don't know why I know, as a Black man from California, I don't know why I know who King Arthur is, but in my mind, I can never really tell if he was an actual person or not because he's so ingrained in all this stuff. Does that kind of thing fascinate you? Because, a lot of, like you could say an element of The Magicians could be this friction between science and magic. And with The Bright Sword, there's this friction between religions, religious concepts, and I guess, magic as well within those confines.
I'll say something embarrassing, which is that I never really used to be interested in history. It was always a class that was not that hard, and I was grateful for it, but I never thought about it after I took a history class. And then I started writing a novel that was set in the medieval period, and I had to actually figure out, what shoes do they wear? What do they eat? Do they have forks? Have they invented forks yet? No, there was no one who made forks. They just had knives, no forks. I had to figure out exactly what was going on and what was happening. And I became just totally fascinated by it. And the medieval period, part of the problem with the medieval period is it's really, really long, as it turns out. It starts from fall of the Western Roman Empire, so early 5th century, up for about 1,000 years. So If you can imagine lumping together the past 1,000 years and saying, well, that was a period of time, it's hard to generalize about it. I think it's one reason it's hard to hold it in our heads. And Arthur lived, if he lived, he would.
And is that a debate? Is that a debate? Whether
big debate? Yeah,
okay.
Big debate. Not, and it has not been settled. Possibly never will be. There are funny little textual traces of Arthur that go back quite a long way.
Okay.
There's a poem in Old Welsh that it's hard to date, but it's probably from the 7th century. And there's a sort of long elegy in it for a great warrior and how awesome he was and how many people he killed. And then at the end of it, it says, but he was no Arthur. And that's the first piece of reference we have of Arthur in history. And already at that time, people were supposed to know who Arthur was. Like there was no question what Arthur they were talking about because he was that famous.
Yeah.
But whether he was a real person or possibly this sort of story that people told, I think when the Anglo-Saxons were moving in, the Welsh were resisting them. It's possible they invented this hero to kind of inspire them and tell stories about. It is possible that there was no actual Arthur who lived. But we will probably never know. It was such a chaotic period of time. People were not spending a lot of time writing things down, and so the evidence it's very scant.
Yeah.
The thing about the Arthur story is that that as soon as it was like a runaway viral hit, as soon as people thought this story about King Arthur started circulating, people loved it and they told it over and over again. And even after the Anglo-Saxons came in and took over that story, then the Anglo-Saxons started telling stories about Arthur. And then the French started telling stories about Arthur, even though he's an English king. If you ever wonder why there is a French guy at King Arthur's court and he's the best at everything, it's because the French really loved King Arthur. There was a huge vogue character Lancelot, who then migrated into the English versions of the story, and that's why there's an awesome French guy in the story. That's the story. People just kept telling it over and over and over again. It wouldn't go away, and it sort of evolved, and they added things. They added Camelot and the Round Table and all the stuff, and people kept telling it over this entire 1,000 years of the medieval period. And as a result, because it picked up details as it went along, every time people retold it, it becomes this sort of funny mashup of all of medieval history. And the actual story doesn't really belong in any particular time period. Sure, Arthur was supposed to be alive in the early 6th century, but they hadn't really invented castles back then. Castles came in hundreds of years later with the Normans, and so we retrofit Arthur with a castle.
You've really gone from being someone who was like, I'd never focused on history, to someone who was spilling a lot of historic knowledge. I know that.
No one is boring as a King Arthur bore, and so I myself up. But one of the reasons why it's hard to situate Arthur in your head as being real or fictional is because he's a little bit of both.
A little bit of both. I'm thinking of that quote from at least the Lord of the Rings movie. I'm assuming it comes from some portion of the book. History became legend, legend became myth, and it feels like a bit of that is at play here. And it feels like there's a through line here with your work of like of a sort of interrogation here as well. There's an interrogation of a type of novel like the Fillory books in The Magicians, and there's an interrogation of this myth that no one really knows how to sort out with this latest book.
It's fun. It's funny. I always try to I like to run an interrogation, but I also I love a love story. I always take if I'm writing in a genre, I always take it super seriously, and probably more so in Arthur than I did, for example, in The Magicians. I can remember in the early drafts of the Arthur book, I would make him. I made Arthur kind of a goof, like he was drunk all the time. He pulled a sword out of a stone, but he was a very fallible. He was sort of like a Robert Baratheon in a way.
Huh.
If you're into Game of Thrones at all, and I thought that would be a good way to question the convention of the Arthur stories, that Arthur is a great king, and it didn't work at all. It turned out you couldn't be funny about Arthur in that way, because then he becomes just another king. He stops being King Arthur. It turns out there's some conventions that you cannot chop away. And in fact, the genre does kind of collapse. And there are versions of Arthur that are bad Arthur versions, but I've never found one that I really loved that much. So there were aspects of it that I simply had to embrace and not interrogate at all.
Yeah.
Which is tricky because he's the thing about Arthur is that he's very good. He is a good guy. In a way, the good guys are often less lovable than the villains. They're not flawed in that relatable way. So the challenge of the Bright Sword was to write an Arthur who felt real, but at the same time had that almost superhuman goodness about him.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that the other thing I'll say about that is that there have been so many Arthurs in the past few decades where they stripped out all the magic from it, and really regrounded it in the dirt and the mud, and have that's all there is. There is only dirt and mud and nothing else. We'll die and maybe go to heaven. Who knows? I wanted to. I realized that was another part of the story that I wanted to. That had been interrogated enough, and I wanted to go back the other way and flood the world with enchantments and not just enchantments, but the divine. I wanted God and angels to be part of the world as well. I felt as though that had been interrogated enough.
I want to talk a bit about religion because what makes it such a fascinating read is that the main character is a Christian, and he starts dealing with fairies and things like that, and he doesn't, and you really do a great job of getting into his mind of like, oh, I'm talking to a pagan now. What's gonna happen here? And there's a beautiful, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it suggested that like fairies were once gods, and over time, as perhaps, people's concepts of religion evolved, they got smaller and they shrank. But then the question of like, why are they still here? What is the one true God's purpose for having them around? And I liked how you deal with all that. But was it a challenge to get into the mind of a wandering Christian man in this period, or how did
the Christians than the pagans? Pagans as are lovable in that way. We all know about pagans. They have their gods. Their gods are magic and interesting, but they can also, have sex and have all kinds of vices, and it's not such a huge deal. They're earthy. The pagans are super earthy and fun. But Arthur's a Christian, and I didn't want to sort of shilly-shally around that. It's the core story of the Arthur legendarium is probably the quest for the Holy Grail, and there's no way you do that in any other way than in a devoutly Christian way. And the only way in which I felt like I was trying to ask questions that had not been asked was this business of the coexistence of these two kinds of the supernatural in one world. It's one of the great things about Arthur's story is that it has two magic systems, and they sort of are threaded through each other, and they're both integral parts of the world.
That's always been fascinating. Yeah.
And yet they are fundamentally incompatible. They're not running on the same voltage or whatever. So it is generally the case that in Arthur, the two sides don't interact, and you'll have angels, and then the fairies will sort of go away for a bit, and the fairies will come in. The angels will look the other way. It was one of the things that I wanted to do very much, was to bring that latent crisis to an actual crisis, and have some fairies fight a bunch of angels and see what happens. I wanted to meet face to face and say, okay, we've been living in this country together for a long time, and we've had it. It's time we had it out and figured out whose country this is. I really needed to bring that to a boil, and there's a cracking good battle chapter where everybody, they have it out, and of course that was what was happening, at least on in Arthur's Britain at that time. The pagans were a very live presence, and then the Christians were being very effective in spreading Christianity, which came with Rome. And the Christians were very good at, once they had converted pagans, at deleting them from the historical record. So it's hard to know a lot about what actually went on with the pagans. But that was a very real thing that was part of Arthur's world, that balance. I'm not the first person to have done that. Certainly, Marion Zimmer Bradley in Mists of Babylon did a very interesting take on that, from which I borrowed some. It definitely seemed like, for me, it was a key part of the story, and a big sort of opportunity to do something that, even though we've been telling the story for 1,000 or more years, nobody has done that in that very aggressive upfront way. Just as people had not told a lot of stories about gay knights and trans knights. We hadn't really explored what happened after Arthur died. It's funny when you think of the story as being so done, as I did for a long time. You think of the story as being so played, and then you start picking through it, and you realize there's so much here that people have never explored. Yeah,
I think it's brilliant that you focused on that in that way, because since I was young, I remember, there was the zeitgeist about Harry Potter at the time, and then it was like the Lord of the Rings films were bubbling up, and I, as someone who grew up in a Christian household, I was fascinated by the fact that mainstream Christianity had no issue with the Lord of the Rings somehow. Same amount of magic, but the Harry Potter books, and it was like, what is the division there? That's so strange and weird to me. And we have a comment here from Elliot saying, I love the fairy angel battle so much. Also, Lev, I really love your humor. So
it's good to hear. It's good to hear. I have to. I want to pause for just a second to mention the fact that Tolkien was very devout Christian. Even though he was telling me that were arguably pagan, or at least very loose interpretation of Christianity, including in Middle Earth. He saw them as being in the service of prosecuting Christian ideas and purposes. And
so maybe that's part of the underlying. As long as you can sense this underlying blueprint, it's okay to dabble in magic and have a wand and fight Balrogs. I want to talk a bit about, because I work in media and in television, and I love kind of learning how things translate. And so I want to talk about the process of bringing the magicians to the screen. And I think we can even play a trailer now. I know you don't like to travel back in time, but let's take a look at the trailer for the magicians on Sci-Fi.
You have these notions about what life could be, but eventually you have to let all that go. It's a part of growing up.
Julia, I learned magic tricks just to keep up with you. It was our thing.
Yeah, it was our thing. Life is starting for real.
It is here that our story begins. A land of magic.
Am I hallucinating?
If you were, how would asking me help?
Quentin, you are not crazy. Magic is real.
Do the goddamn magic! Stop it! Holy shit, I'm doing this. I cannot believe that I survived this long not knowing that I was a magician.
I can't just go to Yale if I know this place exists.
Magic doesn't come from talent, it comes from pain. The worst shit is somehow also the exact shit that makes you better. Live, work, play, drink, study, screw, drink, cram, drink.
Magic does feel pretty great.
Quentin Coldwater. There you are.
Now, let's see some magic.
So how does it feel to go back to 2016 there?
It's been a while since I watched that.
Is it scary? I imagine it's scary to lend your work to a team of writers and directors and producers. Is there any concern when you make a deal like that?
Yeah, actually, there was a real there was a real journey for me into learning to collaborate in that way. I'm sure you are far more accustomed than I am to working with a whole bunch of different people and trying to get something off the ground. When you're writing a novel, it's what you have so much control over what's going on. You have a genteel chat with your editor once in a while. Might be happening in your book, but really, word for word, it's there on the page. You can just everything just so. And when I realized that other people would be writing dialogue for my characters, and still even other people would be playing those characters and doing line readings the way that they liked, I have to admit it was a little bit of a crisis for me. I didn't know how to understand that. The fact that I couldn't tell them what to do. I could not stand over them and say,
you can only make suggestions. It makes me think about actually that sort of like tormented state that George Lucas seemed to be in after he sold Star Wars to Disney, and I think you could kind of tell in some of those interviews afterwards that he was learning how to process that. But what are the upsides of going through that process? Did it affect your work going forward? Does having written and right now there's this crazy thing happening right now where a lot of people who are primarily screenwriters are being told to, hey, write this as a short story first. Make this somehow pre-existing IP. So I almost just like, I don't want you to describe The Magicians as pre-existing IP, but does that kind of trigger something in your brain where it's like, oh, everything that I write is now pre-existing IP. I know how to have these conversations about this next book with certain people.
It's funny. I've actually been told that go away, write a short story, and then maybe we can talk. People really do say that. It was a great experience doing The Magicians. I want to say that, and I what I had to do was some growing up and understanding that other people's takes on the story were as valid as mine was. And they had amazing ideas. I'm reminded of the image of the beast in the classroom with the moths fluttering around his face, and I almost basically re-edited my book in my head so that they had the moths in the book. They weren't there, and it was such a good idea. They did things with characters that were so wonderful, and I just sat there and was amazed. So I had to get over myself. And then there is that funny thing. Then you go back, you've been through this whole process and you realize, oh, that's how it works. Can I optimize what I'm writing now so that will happen? And I have come to the opinion that is death, to think about another medium while you're writing in one medium. Something that is a novel, it has to be a novel to the core. It cannot be a treatment for something visual. And novels, they're my first love. It's the way that I like to tell stories. I have done a fair amount of screenwriting in the past few years, but the fact that I always get to the point where I'm like, what's the part where I say what they're all thinking? And you can't do that. You have to cue the audience somehow through visual, whatever, that something's going on under the surface. The fact that in novels you can just dive under the surface.
But that would be great if there's sort of a pop-up video style film where it's like, by the way, Quentin is smelling this right now.
Well, when I've been working in comics as well, in graphic novels, and the amazing thing about graphic novels is you can do both in them. You have that visual take on what's going on, but then you can have a little box where you say what people are thinking at the same time. In some ways, it is it's the perfect medium.
Yeah.
You can have it all in comics, but it's not my mother tongue as a writer, and I feel I've been more or less successful in forgetting about that side of things. When I write novels, novels are so unvisual. All you're giving people, the reader, is it's like they're in the dark, and you're feeding them one word at a time, and then it all comes to life in their minds, in their own way. It's just incredibly wonderful. And then, Hollywood is incredibly fun, and it spreads your stories into places that they never would have gone otherwise. But I feel like for that to happen, you have to first make it work on paper.
And I just want to let everyone watching know that we are going to be opening things up to questions that I'll be asking, and we have some of them coming in right now. But I want to just kind of wrap up this discussion element talking about the amount of time it took for you to write The Bright Sword. I've seen you comment. You don't have to dive too much into this. I know it was torturous for you in many respects, and it took about 10 years to finish this. But let's talk a little bit about that. But I also want to know what it's like to figure out the voice of a narrator for two different properties. Both of the series, The Magicians and The Bright Sword, are written from what's the technical term for this? Is it omniscient?
Or
third person.
Yeah.
But is there a difference between these two third persons?
That's such a good question. No one has ever asked me that question. That is such a good question. And in some ways, there is no difference. What in the biz, what we would call what I'm doing in The Magicians and The Bright Sword is it's close third person. So there is a narrator, but that narrator can't know anything that the character that they're telling the story about doesn't know. So when Colum's on the page, the narrator knows nothing that Colum doesn't know, and furthermore, the narrator becomes Colum-y. They start to talk a little bit like Colum, not completely, but they take on, the narrator becomes a little bit like Colum, just as when Palamides doing Palamides, the narrator becomes a bit Palamides-y. That's part of the third person, mode. And the Bright, it turns out to be the only mode that I can do. And
so that is you. And what was the journey of finding that? Are all of your published works in this specific voice? In terms of okay, and so is that even a question when you start to come up with your new ideas at all? Because I find that's like
I wrote one short story. It was one of those things where I tried to explain the idea to someone in Hollywood, and they said write a short story, and I did. And that became The Map of Tiny Perfect Things, which was a movie that I wrote, but I had to write a short story, and that was in the first person. I'm just, for the record, saying, actually, I did once do another thing, even though I mostly just do the same thing all the time. But it was a different. I would say that it was a different narrator a bit. I think that the narrator is probably more straight ahead in The Bright Sword, and that narrator has a lot of exposition to do because you're building this medieval world that people are not so familiar with. And in Magicians, it's set in the present day. Maybe you're out in a city, or maybe you're at a magic school, or you're in Fillory. Everybody knows what those look like. They look like Narnia or Hogwarts, but everyone has a mental picture. The medieval world was strange, and I had to do a lot more world building to make it come to life. But otherwise, I suppose it was quite similar. I'm not the same person I was when I wrote The Magicians. I wrote The Magicians. It seemed so long ago. It was like a marriage ago. I was really depressed. I was living by myself. Now I have a family. I'm so much more settled in myself, and I feel like I know myself much better than I did back then. So I'm sure that narrator has changed in ways that I'm probably not fully conscious of.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for engaging with some of my wild questions here. And now I'd like to open things up to some of the wild questions from some of the viewers. I guess I'll start with Albert. Albert says, thank you both for this fantastic book discussion. Can you comment on what influences The Once and Future King by T.H. White had on The Bright Sword? Thank you.
I think that one reason The Bright Sword took so long is that I had to figure out how to I had to do an Arthur that was different from The Once and Future King. That was a book that I probably read The Once and Future King, reread it more times than I have reread any other book. And when I started writing Bright Sword, it sounded like fake T.H. White. And that was, as it turned out, that didn't work at all. I needed to find my Arthur, and my Lancelot and my Gawain. I had to figure out my versions of those, and there's no way this happens without Once and Future King. T.H. White was the person who took that story, the medieval story, and retold it according to modern novelistic conventions. Nobody had ever done that, and it's astoundingly great that he did that. It's just such a work of genius, and yet I had to figure out what my version of that was, things that he hadn't done. T.H. White, we don't know everything about him, but it's clear that his sexuality was sort of not straightforward. He was probably gay, but he only had very straight relationships very heterosexual relationships in Once and Future King, because the world was not ready for a gay Knight of the Round Table, but it is now. And so that was one of those moments, actually, when I read when I thought maybe there is a point to doing this, even though we have the Once and Future King. Maybe there's maybe it's time for something new. I think, and the other part is we kind of lose Arthur in The Once and Future King. He's everything is about him in the first book, but then he sort of vanishes as a character because he doesn't have very much to do. He doesn't really go on the big adventures. And I felt as though there was a blank spot there that I could fill in a little bit. What was it like to be Arthur during that time when everybody else was going off and looking for the Holy Grail?
Heidi says, love The Magicians, looking forward to reading The Bright Sword. Albert Zaleski Bin Bassa writes, Tim Barnes had done a Banned Books comedy show for Culture Connection last year. I swear I did not write this. I had my hands. You saw my hands this whole time. I did not write this. Can you comment on this subject? Can you comment on the state of banned books? How do you feel about what's happening with that right now?
Obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious. One of the ways that I became the person that I am was by ranging around a library full of unbanned books, and in a way that was, no one was curating them for me. Nobody was saying what was okay to read, what was not okay to read. That was a hugely important part of my becoming who I was and figuring out how words work and how the world works. The idea that would not be available to somebody is it's upsetting. I oppose book bans. I'm part of the Authors Against Book Bans. I don't believe that the bans will last is the thing. I don't almost take them that seriously because I see them as such an aberration. That's not how I think of as America as working. I don't think that they will stick. I certainly have seen high schools and junior highs ban The Magicians. There's stuff in The Magicians that, maybe I would certainly not give it to anybody under the age of 14. I wouldn't ban it, but it doesn't break my heart that, an 11-year-old can't pick up the Magicians. But the idea, the principle of banning things, it's the straight up fascist playbook. It's how you oppress the people, is take away their books. And it's so stupid that I just feel that we will course correct before too long.
Bringing up that element of the magicians, because I've seen some of these debates about Quentin. Should we like Quentin? Do you like Quentin?
Quentin is a deeply flawed person. What I was trying to do with Quentin most of all was create a character who he was, among other things, struggling with his mental health. He was depressed, probably got a little bit of narcissistic personality disorder somewhere in there. And the truth is, dealing with people who have struggled with their mental health, I have been such a person. I certainly have known a lot of such people, a lot of people like that. It is often not super pleasant. The reality of being of having that struggle isn't always about being likable and relatable. And you feel bad for the person. Part of, I think, the real struggle of mental health, the part that people don't want to talk about, is how unappealing it is sometimes. And I feel that it's polarizing. I feel like some people look at Quentin and they say, yeah, that is what it's like. And that's what people like that are like. That's what I was like when I was 17. And yet I would never pretend that he would be on a lot of people's list of fictional characters to have dinner with. Rather have dinner with Elliot than Quentin, much as I love him, and I do love him.
Nice. We got a few from Elliot here, so I'm going to read both of these, and I haven't read these yet, so let's see if there's a way to combine an answer to them. You are clearly such a meticulous craftsman, and yet your books flow so beautifully. Just feeling like these are the real thoughts and experiences of the characters. I admire that so much. And I think that kind of ties into what we're talking about with Quentin. We're entering his mind quite often. It's up to debate whether we like what's entering his mind. I love how you share your admiration of other writers, introduce me to new faves, wondering whether you have a group of writer friends who share what they're working on, like Tolkien and Lewis, etc.
For a long time, I really didn't. I think for most of my career, I know a lot of writers. For some reason, my closest friends tend not to be writers, and there aren't too many writers with whom I am close enough.
You curse so much, Lev. I gotta tell you, maybe
drives people away. There aren't very many writers that I know that I feel that kind of trust that must have existed between Tolkien and Lewis because when you show somebody, it's all right to publish a final draft. To show somebody an early draft, there's stuff in there that nobody ever wants to see. But you can't tell which stuff it is. Somebody has to tell you. That's oddly, since I have moved to Sydney, which was a couple of years ago, there's a small group of people who I'm quite open with about my books, but that's a new thing for me. Mostly it has all been a dialogue in my head. I think it's probably one reason it took me so long to write The Bright Sword, is I could have used other people's perspectives more, and for some reason I didn't have that social thing that allowed me to find those people and build that kind of circle.
It's just like with Elliot, we have a few from D, so I'll read these two as well. The Magicians is something that I constantly go back to, and it has some of my favorite all-time character arcs. What is your approach to writing such relatable characters? And D also wrote, thank you for letting us in on your process. You have written some of my favorite characters. I know it is a broad question, but how do you approach character arcs? This is a pro Quentin household.
It makes me feel good to know that they're out there. Characters are the single hardest part for me. And I struggle with them so much. And I think in my early drafts, one thing that happens is that people I often leave out the dialogue in my early draft. People walk around, they doing things, but they're very quiet and they don't talk because their voices aren't clear to me yet. And then sometimes when they do talk, they all sound like me, which is very well. It is a real. I find it to be the most humbling part of being a writer, is truly trying to be empathic to somebody who feels quite distant from who you are, and to kind of merge with them, and that's a stupid word, merge with them in that way, but to kind of find that person in yourself. I don't have a good answer to this because I do find it so hard. The book I'm working on right now, without exaggeration, I rewrote the first chapter 20 times. And it was because I couldn't hear him. I couldn't hear him talk. I could logically reason out the kinds of things that he probably would say, but I was going sort of from the outside in, and I wasn't connected with that person in that way that you have to be. I'm still not sure that I completely am. It's fitful, the connection, but without it, you end up with characters who feel very stock. It's the biggest struggle that I have as a writer.
Well, I think it's interesting that you start with what the characters are doing and you don't focus on dialogue for a little bit, because and I'm sure you find fun ways to do this when you're writing screenplays as well. You have to keep characters doing something while they're doing that exposition, and it feels like I almost feel like if you were an actor, this would be your method for discovering character as well. You would do these actions before you start memorizing your lines, perhaps. I see one other question here, and I'd say that if maybe 3 more, if there are other questions that might pop up. But was there something you were going to say there?
No, go ahead.
Okay. This is from G. Jimenez. I hope I'm saying that correctly. You're a fabulous writer, and the Magician's books and show have helped me so much. Was the cozy horse in the books in any way inspired by the Wizard of Oz novels?
I'm sure it was. I think I do those Oz books a disservice because I often talk about how English fantasy is, and how I always felt that I was taking an English tradition and moving it to America. America has this great homespun fantasy tradition. It's got Robert E. Howard, and it's got the Oz books, which are great. And I read them all when I was a kid. And when I reread them to my kids, or some of them, I was surprised at how much they held up, how extremely entertaining they were, and fun, and compelling. I'm sure the cozy horse, well, it's got Oz in it, cozy. I'm sure the cozy horse comes to some extent out of Oz. It definitely has an Aussie feel about it.
I also want to give you a bit of a compliment here, because I think that, and this is not doing that thing where you should think about your work in terms of IP or what it can be afterwards, but there is a speed to which your work kicks into gear. There isn't a lot of that Tolkien-esque, let's hang out for a bit. Things happen fairly quickly. Like, we get to break bills really quickly in The Magicians. People die really quickly in The Bright Sword. Is that just like something that's a preference for you, or are there chapters that we never see that kind of build up to these inciting incidents?
I can remember reading a negative review of one of my books. It was of The Magician King. But I always remember this sentence from it where the reviewer said, Grossman sets about his work with his customary narrative energy. And it wasn't a very complimentary review. I like the sound of that narrative energy. What you're seeing is my short attention span. I'm not super patient with the early throat clearing parts of books. And with my own books, I like them to flow along, and not hang around. It's very important to me when you look at the ends of my chapters. I try to make them dovetail with the one that's coming next, so that that movement is uninterrupted. And I try not to hang around. I try to keep the thread very taut, because it's what I like when I'm reading. The writers I admire most do that in this wonderful, effortless way that I aspire to.
Well, nice. Well, it seems like you're incredibly in tune with your id. I hope that you're having a wonderful process with your current work. And hey, if it takes a decade, it takes a decade. No one's No one's rushing you right now. You make great work. And I'd like to thank Culture Connection, and of course Eve Ethart, who is the social media manager, who's making all these comments pop up, who did this cool thing where he put my website that I need to pay for so that it appears if you do look this up. And thank you all for hanging out with us. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we go, Lev?
I want to thank you, Tim, for asking the questions and being the host, and making it all happen.
Thank you very much. I believe in you. I believe in all of you watching, and I hope we live unbanned lives fairly soon. I guess this is the part where we say, y'all come back now, you hear? And wave.
That's right.